Okay, great. I will go ahead and formally kick this off. Welcome everybody who's joined us for the 2021 Stormwater Code and Manual Update public meeting. Today is July 28th. We'll be meeting from 3:15 until 5 o'clock today, and wanting to let everybody know that we are recording this presentation, and we've started recording now in the interest of sharing with interested parties who aren't able to join us for today's call. Go ahead to the next slide, please. On the screen, you will see a few ground rules that I'll be walking through really quickly just to ensure that our online space together this afternoon works for everybody. There are lots of attendees as well as multiple speakers that will be speaking today. Few tips: using your computer to connect to WebEx seems to provide the most reliable connectivity throughout the course of our meeting today. And then also, if you'd like to, taking a few moments to test out the hand raise function as well as the chat function. We'll be monitoring chat throughout the course of the day, and also we'll be looking at hand raises as well during the Q&A period. And also a point of, just in terms of a process point, we'll be addressing clarifying questions as we're able to during the course of the presentations today, but do have a formal Q&A period at the end of the presentation, and we'll address any additional questions at that time. Questions that we don't get to during the Q&A period, we will be sure to provide answers to and get those responses posted online as well. Another tip is to use your phone or headset, and to please keep either your phone or headset, however you're calling in today, muted unless you are speaking to the group. We have a poll that's active as well, so if you can just take a moment to answer the poll questions, we're excited to see who's in attendance today. And that poll will be open for the next couple of minutes. Next slide, please. If you're having any technical issues or have questions about the chat and/or the hand raise function on WebEx, please either call or email Brent Edgar, our colleague today, and his contact information is on the screen, both his phone number and his email. So don't hesitate to give him a call. If you're having any technical issues, he's available to help troubleshoot with you. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're meeting from 3:15 today until 5, and we do have a lot to cover. You'll see the agenda in front of you on the slide here. And we'll start with a welcome and some introductions in terms of who the speakers are today. Then we'll move into providing the project background and where we are in terms of the overall project timeline. You all will then be hearing about key code changes, the new director's rule, and key stormwater manual changes. We'll then do a quick wrap up, and then we'll formally adjourn before hosting a short Q&A session at the end. During the Q&A, we, as I mentioned, will be either responding to all the questions that we're able to get to during the Q&A period that are submitted via chat, or if you would like to verbally share your question, please also raise your hand, and we'll be monitoring both chat and the hand raise function throughout the course of today's meeting. So who are the speakers for today? I'll just first introduce myself, and will be serving as facilitator for the day. My name is Gretchen Muller, and I'm a director at Cascadia Consulting Group, and I've been providing communications support for this project. Sherelle Ehlers is the Stormwater Policy Advisor at Seattle Public Utilities, and she is Seattle Public Utilities Program Manager for this project, and is also leading the Stormwater Code and Volume 1 updates. She will be presenting the key Stormwater Code updates today. Mary Weber is a senior civil engineer at Seattle Public Utilities. She's been one of the technical leads on the Volume 3, Appendix C, and Appendix D updates for the 2021 manual. She won't be presenting today, but will be available for Q&A. Matthew Bateman from SDCI, member of the city's core team, and has provided input on the submittal requirements and design criteria in Volume 1, Volume 3, and Appendix B of the 2021 manual. He'll be presenting a portion of the key stormwater manual updates related to Appendix B today, as well as available for Q&A. Rebecca Dulopowski is an associate engineer at Herrera. She is the consultant team project manager and also one of the technical leads on the Volume 3 updates. She'll be presenting on the project background and status update and a majority of the key stormwater manual updates today. And with that, I will turn it over to Sherelle for opening remarks.
Got to remember the unmute. Thank you, Gretchen. I just want to say thank you for everyone taking the time to attend today's meeting. And along with the external input that we've received so far, I just want to acknowledge that there's been a big team effort that involves different departments, including SPU, SDCI, and SDOT. Sorry, I got to get rid of a cat. And parks, both their time and expertise. And I also want to acknowledge that this update was especially difficult due to the global pandemic and all of the things that everyone is balancing while they're trying to do their work. And I really appreciate it. And I know it's been really hard. So I also especially want to thank Liz Anderson for all her support and tenacity and expertise throughout the years and on this project. She's been a great mentor to me and many others in the city. And she's planning on retiring at the end of this in February. And I just wanted to say thank you. Her institutional knowledge and positivity and stewardship of the city will be greatly missed, and as she retires. And she's been an invaluable asset, not only in past stormwater code and manual updates, but in developing standards, mentoring, including myself. I see her as a great mentor, and as well as review of big projects that have shaped the city of Seattle, such as sound transit and other big items in the city that have come through. So Liz, congratulations, and you'll be dearly missed, and best wishes for everyone on your next adventure. As far as the update of the stormwater manual and code go, we're nearing the end of this time in the update process, so that we meet our regulatory requirements under the city's MS4 MPDS permit, which one of those requirements is making this document effective on July 1st of this year. I appreciate both internally and externally everyone's input and comments we've received so far on the documents, and we've done our best to incorporate comments where we can, and we'll be sharing those updates with you today. And just as a reminder, these are proposed changes, and we'll rely on your input, city policies, ecology approval, as well as the council and mayor approval. And as a reminder that this is our third public review, and Rebecca will go over the timeline shortly on how you can provide feedback. And thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherelle. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to provide a description of the project background as well as a status update on where things are right now.
Sounds good. Thanks, Gretchen. Should I close the poll out now or leave it open for a couple more minutes? What do you think?
Yeah, maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes and then you can close it out.
Okay, I'll wait till the end of my section then. Got a couple more minutes to get your answers in. All right, so I just wanted to walk through a little bit of project background. Those of you that have joined us for past public meetings probably recognize these first couple slides here. I always just like to go back to, why we have a stormwater code and a stormwater manual, what the intent of that is, and really that's to protect life, property, and surface waters from harm, meet the requirements of state and federal law, and it's also a requirement under the Federal Clean Water Act and the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. So what's included in the current stormwater code and future stormwater codes is source control for ongoing practices, construction site pollution prevention, and requirements for on-site stormwater management, flow control, and water quality treatment. That's just the high level. Obviously, there's a lot more in there. A little bit of project background. This project is driven by the new Phase 1 permit that came out on July 1st, 2019 and became effective August 1st, 2019, and also the subsequent update to the Ecology Manual, the Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington. We've had internal city staff workshops and a series of meetings starting in the summer and fall of 2019. We also had a series of external outreach meetings starting back in October 2019, where we could actually still have in-person meetings. So that was an in-person meeting. And then we had 2 webinars with the release of the spring 2020 public review draft. We had 1 public webinar last fall with the release of a portion of the manual and the code. So those of you that were involved in that, that was focusing on Volume 1, Appendix B, Appendix I, and the Stormwater Code. And then this webinar today that focuses on the full code and manual and related codes. Here is the overall timeline and where we're at. So we've worked our way through the first and second public review, and we're here on the third public review. So as I mentioned, that's the full manual, related codes, directors, rules, and the full code as well. And then Sherelle mentioned we're moving through the legislative process this spring and targeting that effective date of July 1st, 2021 to meet ecology's requirements. And so I wanted to just jump forward of what we're focusing on. As I mentioned, the legislative process is coming up, so we'll have city council review and a public hearing associated with that process. And then we'll be working on implementation tools and training. So you'll see some things coming out later this year to support applicants and plan reviewers, and also trainings related to the manual updates. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and, let's see, I'll close out the poll and then do this last slide here. Right, so I'll close that out. All right, so for today, there's a few symbols that'll show up in the slides. So you'll see this blue lightning bolt. Those are things that were modified for the fall 2020 public review draft. So those will show up on the Volume 1, Appendix B, Appendix I, and code slides. And then there's this new red lightning bolt that'll show up in anything that got updated for the winter 2021 public review draft. So there's some of those are major changes, some are more minor, and we'll walk through some of the more major changes today. But take a look at that summary of changes document that's posted along with the review document. So there's one related to the code and one related to the manual, and it shows you what's been updated for these various stages and various public reviews. So if you remembered something had changed back in the spring, it may have changed for the winter 2021 draft. So you can look at the 3 different columns there that walk you through the process. And then we also have this green equivalency item here that'll target anything related to equivalency with ecology's permit and manual. All right, are the poll results showing up on everyone's screens?
Yes.
All right, sounds good. So it looks like today we've got a lot of consulting engineers in the room. We've got a lot of city, county engineers as well. Let's see, we've got a few contractors, developers, one from general public. We've got some folks that have attended past public meetings and a variety there. And then favorite water body, Puget Sound looks like it's winning the favorite water body, followed closely by Lake Washington, and then Lake Union and Green Lake after that. So thanks for participating in that. That just kind of helps us know who's in the room with us today, the virtual room. And with that, I'll hand it back to Gretchen to introduce our next speaker.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, who will be presenting on the grading code updates related to the Stormwater Code. Thanks, Matthew.
All right. So we're going to be updating the grading code and primarily to align with the Stormwater Code. You can go to the next slide. The biggest change is the change of the thresholds when a grading permit is required. There was a big discrepancy there's a gap between when the drainage review was required in our current code and when a grading permit was required. And we rely on other permits to administer the drainage review, such as a building permit, grading permit, or a street use permit. So we need to align those so that we're doing drainage review every time it's required. So we changed the land disturbing activity threshold from 1 acre down to 5,000 square feet. Most of the time when you have land disturbing activity of that, you're triggering the grading code for other reasons by mostly the amount of cubic yardage of fill. For the new and replaced hard surface, we changed it from 2,000 square feet down to 750 square feet. And then we also added a new trigger for extracting groundwater. So these are dewatering wells for construction or remediation. So we have a chance to review where water is being discharged to in those situations. But this table here shows you how the 2016, so current drainage code and proposed code and the grading code align. So the land disturbing activity for drainage review threshold, we're going to raise that from 750 up to 5,000. So that'll be less drainage review required. But for grading permits, we're decreasing it from 1 acre down to 5,000, so more grading permits. Then for new and replaced hard surface, we're keeping the 750 square foot threshold for drainage review. And then we're modifying the grading code so the permit is required when there is 750 square feet of new and replaced. All right, next slide, please. We also changed some of the exemptions. There is a utility exemption that exempted all utilities from grading permits, so we changed that so new installation will not be exempt in the ECAs. And for new stormwater systems for short plats and subdivisions, especially those shown on the preliminary drainage plans, the repair and maintenance will still be exempt for existing utilities. And also utility installation outside of the ECAs will be exempt. We removed the exemption for the underground storage tank removal and replacement due to the potential impact those may have. And we revised the exemption for work on railroads to make it clear that, that if the drainage review is triggered for the stormwater code, that you do need a grading permit. And this is because the Stormwater Code administers a federal program, which is the Clean Water Act. So we changed some definitions. We went through to line up with the Stormwater Code and change anywhere that said impervious surface to hard surface. And we just referred to the Stormwater Code for the definition. We've also revised the definition of a potentially hazardous location to include any state or federal list or database that indicates potential contamination. Previously, it was more specific, and so we broadened that to capture any project that may have contamination. Next slide, please. We modified the plans and information required when there is a building permit, mostly to clarify when a separate grading permit or a separate grading plan will be required versus when the grading information can be shown on other plans, like site plans, drainage plans, or street use plans. And the biggest is when a civil engineer is required, and it has to do with the stamping. We also clarified which elements should be shown on the grading plan and clarified that the site plan required with the grading permit shall be prepared per the department standards that will issue the permit. The one last thing we did is added back the authority for the geotechnical reviewers to require minimal risk statements by a geotechnical engineer in geologically hazardous areas. This is something that had been in past grading codes but was missing for some reason. And so that wraps up the grading code. This grading code may come out sooner with some of the building code changes. It's a little up in the air because those are up in the air, so it may be pushed back and be more in line with the stormwater code, but it may come out a couple months ahead of the stormwater code. And with that, I'll hand it back.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matthew. And now I'll turn it over to Sherelle to present on the stormwater code updates.
Great. Thank you. One thing I was remiss in saying thank you is Herrera Consultants have done a lot of work, and especially Rebecca has spent many, many hours on updating the code and manual. So I want to say thank you to the consultants, and especially Herrera, for all the work that they have done as well. So, so with that, I'll get into the key stormwater changes. Most of this information was presented at the spring and fall 2020 public meetings, this overview, but I'm just recapping it here just in case you didn't participate at that time, just to get a high level summary. And that includes adding exemptions for certain land disturbing activities, adding clarifications regarding managing equivalent areas at an alternative location. We also we added and updated several definitions throughout the code, as well as updating terminology and BMP references. And that's generally has to do with the construction, stormwater pollution prevention, and source control sections. And a lot of that was for alignment with ecology's requirements. There's also clarification regarding closely related projects and the timing of construction of shared facilities, as well as adding preliminary drainage review requirements related to master use permits. Continuing that list, there's also adding minimum requirements for mainline extensions and the public drainage system or clarifying them. Updates to on-site stormwater management lists for all project types, revision of flow control requirements for parcel-based projects and roadway projects, revising flow control standards, specifically adding an existing condition standard and updating the peak control standard, and also allowing for landscape management plans as an alternative to water quality for natural turf and landscaped areas. And so since there's a lot of information to cover today, we're not going to represent what we talked about previously, as Rebecca mentioned. So the items above shown on this slide were covered in the fall 2020 presentations. So if you want to hear the presentations for that, you can go back and look at the PowerPoint and the recording for that presentation. And so today we'll just be focusing on what was changed since November. So for definitions, most of the definitions shown here were updated and shown in the November 2020 public review, except for the 3 following definitions. And again, as Rebecca said, it's the red lightning bolt that is signifying what has changed, just as a reminder. We have added to the definition of drainage system curb and gutter as part of the drainage system, which aligns with our MS for a multiple storm sewer system. I'm missing an S in there. National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, or MS4 NPDS permit, that aligns with that, adding curb and gutter in there. And then just updated the stream definition to be consistent with the creek definition that we previously had updated, but I didn't realize both creek and stream were in there. And that's just to match the Washington Administrative Code typologies. And then just added a definition for stormwater plans and specifications. So there's a lot of items on here, but just the changes from previously. In the section for minimum requirements for all projects, revised the language based on feedback from the last review period, and specifically related to updating the timing of construction of stormwater facilities that will serve multiple proposed lots and parcels or tracts, and based on the feedback we got based on permit issuance of building permits and the like. So we revised that language based on that feedback. And also added some requirements in the source control section for all projects, requiring training for construction employees for preventing source control issues during construction, and also cleaning up any contaminated soil that are subject to spills during construction. So the next. So this section here is about extensions of the public drainage system, and in the current 2016 code, there's already a requirement to extend the storm drain, but that requirement was in the authority section of the code, and it sometimes was missed or what have you. So the requirement was added to the minimum requirements for all projects, just to be more transparent when a project would have to extend the public drainage system. And since we added also that initial requirement is based on basically private property and having requirements associated with private property, such as basic what we're calling projects not conducted in the right of way, but for stormwater vernacular, parcel-based projects. And it's similar to what the requirements are right now as enforced, that if it's a large project greater than 5,000 square feet and new and replaced and without a piped public drainage system, the piped part is different, abutting the public place or other projects that pose hazards, that section is mirroring similarly what was in the authority section already, but we also added a new requirement for projects conducted solely in the right of way, and this basically applies to transportation capital projects, and stating that the public drainage system, that was missing in the code, stormwater code before for transportation projects. So that is a new section in concept. And then finally, we in the code we added a requirement that public drainage systems shall be constructed in accordance with standard plan specification, SPU design standards, guidelines, and other rules promulgated by the director of SPU. So I'll go a little bit more into, after I finish the stormwater code changes, I'll go a little bit more into these when I go over the public drainage system rule that further clarifies these code requirements, as well as the existing code requirements regarding ensure sufficient capacity and approved point of discharge. And we covered this slide in the last meeting, but since it's so comprehensive, I'll just go quickly through it. It basically talks about the thresholds for parcel-based projects and the change in threshold for single-family projects. And what this table shows are the changes in thresholds that are shown in bold. One of the things, one of our goals in updating the code and manual was simplifying things where we could. And with that led to most projects aligning at a 5,000 square foot new and plus replaced hard surface with a few exceptions. And so just going through the list, the threshold for on-site stormwater management is not changing. It's still either 750 square feet or 1,500. That's the same. So that hasn't changed. For combined basins, an analysis was completed by the combined sewer team and determined that a smaller threshold for projects in the combined should be implemented to help mitigate the impacts of development. The current threshold for the combined is 10,000 square feet and the proposed is 5,000. So you can see that it's aligning with that 5,000 square foot threshold as well, for both for simplicity, but also for system needs. In mitigating impacts of development. And for creeks and small lake basins, the threshold is currently 2,000 square feet, but that is proposed to be up to 5,000 square feet. So that's actually a less stringent threshold than what was previously, what is in the 2016 code. And for creeks, basins especially, this acknowledges the inefficiency that exists in meeting the pasture standard because of the minimum orifice size of a 1/2 inch. For capacity constrained systems, the threshold is still at 2,000 square feet unless it can be demonstrated that the downstream ditch and culvert system and that's adding ditch and culvert system is new from fall. Previously it was silent on ditch and culvert system, but basically if it has sufficient capacity, peak flow control would not be required, but you'd have to demonstrate that. An engineer of record is still required at 5,000 square feet, as well as if there's a no point of discharge for your project. That is not a change, but a new requirement has been added that if your project needs a hydraulic project approval permit, then an engineer of record is also required. And finally, just noting that if you're a single family, if you were a single family project, you could have up to 10,000 square feet of new and replaced. That threshold is now at 5,000 square feet of new and replaced, which aligns along with that 5,000 square foot threshold. So next, let's see, we're on the same. I'm looking at notes here and that and in the slides there, so it's a little discombobulated. So for this this winter or this current public review period, as I just mentioned previously, for the capacity constraint system, we said it states that you don't have to do flow control if you can demonstrate there's downstream capacity, but just clarifying that that only includes ditch and culverts in the system. So, And similarly, the same change it has been updated for the roadway project. So you can go to the next slide. It's basically, and then the other bullets, like I've said, like we've been saying, were presented in the fall 2020 presentation. So these two next slides were presented last time, but I'll just go over them again, just because most projects have to do on-site stormwater management. So this slide is highlighting the changes that generally apply to single-family residential projects and parcel-based projects. And the first one is adding that infiltration trenches can be used for non-roof hard surfaces, but evaluation is not required. And then also this is a new BMP was added to category 2. It's called the sidewalk trail compost amended strip. It's not the best name. If you have recommendations on naming that, please let us know. But it's basically a CAVS and can be used in lieu of permeable pavement. And that new BMP can be used on any of the on-site lists. We also have moved the non-infiltrating bioretention and vegetated roofs and rainwater harvesting down to category 4, which causes a shift for the former category 4's BMPs to be category 5. And we also added that, and one of the reasons we did that is because we're reducing the size required of non-infiltrating bioretention to meet instead of being sized at the 5% basically area that a lot of to match the infiltrating, the sizing is only required to be for the water quality sizing, which is a smaller size than is currently required now for the non-infiltrating bioretention. And then rainwater harvesting is still an option for category 2. And if a project wants to use rainwater harvesting as a category 2 BMP, that needs to be sized to meet the on-site stormwater management performance standard. But that evaluation is not required at the category 2 level. Instead, if you get down into the category now 4, the rainwater harvesting evaluation is required for projects over 20,000 square feet, similar to that threshold, but the sizing volume is sized for a 25% volume reduction. And this was based on feedback that we've gotten from designers that are designing this, that a 25% volume reduction is a much more reasonable target for most projects. And then just remove newly planted trees to acknowledge that both new and retained trees count on the on-site list. So for the trail and sidewalk project, similarly to the single family and parcel based project, like I mentioned, this sidewalk trail compost amended strip has been added to category 2. And then as a separate category at the bottom, trees have been added to both the trail and sidewalk projects as well as roadway projects. So now moving on to flow control. I think I'm a little behind in time, so I'll try and speed it up. For the 2021 Stormwater Code update, there's 2 changes related to flow control that are other than the wetland required changes from ecology. And one is adding the existing condition standard. And we talked about this last time, but the change here is that previously the existing condition standard said that you had to match up to the 50-year peak flow. And it's been altered so that if you're a non-creek basin, you only have to match up to the 25-year peak flow. But if you're in a creek basin, you have to match up to the 50-year. And that's because of equivalency with ecology's permit. And basically, the existing condition mainly applies to small lake basins and roadway projects. The other change for flow control is the peak standard was updated, and that was to reflect downstream impacts of the project and to optimize control based on smaller storm events. And so the peak control standard, the larger storm event is not changing, and that is that it's still 0.4 CFS per acre at the 25-year storm event, but a lower standard for the 2-year and a new standard for the 5-year are included at 0.07 and 0.1 CFS respectively. And then the next few slides I'll go through, they're similar to what I talked about last time. And so there's basically 3 different scenarios that I'll be going through in these 3 next slides. And the first one is for infiltrating bioretention, and the 2 others are for detention vaults. And for each scenario, there's a pre-sized change, which is the orange box. Or, well, they're kind of both orangish, but orangish, we'll say. For those projects that we're using the pre-sized table, and for the other projects, the yellowish more box is if you were doing modeling and not using pre-sized. One thing to note is in the fall, we had a higher, a standard, basically what we're proposing today is results in smaller BMPs than what was proposed in the fall. So first, an example, we'll look at infiltrating bioretention. And this is for 4,000 square feet going to a bioretention. And if you were using the pre-sized tables, the size is actually now a bit smaller than the 2016 sizing. It's actually gone down. And my understanding, and it's explained to me, is the Van Ganuchen was incorporated into that sizing, and actually made this in the 25-year still controls for the infiltrating bioretention, but it goes down just because we had to incorporate a Van Ganuchen formula. Anyway, too much detail, but it's going down slightly, about 9% in this scenario. If you're modeling, your infiltration is going to be about approximately 80% larger. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is if you were previously modeling, you were using the default parameters that were in MGS or WWHM. And those parameters typically are not realistic for most sites in the city of Seattle. And so in updating the stormwater manual, there'll be either required parameters or site-specific parameters that are required when modeling. And that will, using actually site-specific parameters is resulting in larger facilities, even if the peak standard hadn't changed. But then again, if you're accounting for the smaller storm events on the peak standard, the sizing is also going up because of that. So, and I think Rebecca's going to go over this a little bit more of where you would make those changes in modeling when she goes to the volume 3 items. So, and this is similar. You can see that pre-sized is slightly decreasing on detention vaults for smaller sizes. But if you're modeling, it's actually going up again because of holding and accounting for those smaller storm events. And if that's for the 5,000 square foot threshold, or 4,000 square feet, I should say. But if you're going at a larger, if you have larger area that you're mitigating for, the previous pre-sized tables didn't allow for an orifice size change. So it was always a 1/2-inch orifice, but as you get bigger, you can use a larger orifice and still meet the peak standard. So this round for 2021, we have optimized the orifice size so that it's actually resulting in a smaller facility if you were using the pre-sized. But then if you were optimizing in your modeling, then the sizing is going up because of that similar default parameters that I was talking about and the change in the peak standard. So very quickly, once landscape management plans, we were allowing landscape management plans. We proposed, and Ecology accepted, that we could use landscape management plans in lieu of water quality for pollution generating pervious surfaces, but we just needed to clarify that does not apply to artificial turf, just to be clear, because we don't want to have those discussions. So, and finally, just 2 comments that we got from ecology were making sure that we say that you have to maintain or follow your landscape management plan. So we changed that. And then also, if you sell your property, you need to inform future owners that a landscape management plan exists and that you need to follow it. So, and then now I'll go through this new director's rule, and that further implements the code language that I just previously discussed. So to help and support the implementation of the stormwater code, the city is creating a new SP-specific director's rule. The content of the rule clarifies 5 sections of the stormwater code. The first 3 are existing stormwater code requirements, which include approved point of discharge, ensure sufficient capacity, and the requirements to extend a main line, which are in the, like I said, in the authority section, but are now included in the minimum requirements for all projects. In addition, new language was added for mainline extensions for transportation projects. And then finally, just noting that you have to follow rules promulgated for the public drainage system is also part of this document. So going through the main parts that people are most interested in, I think today, are that ensure sufficient capacity is an existing code language and is not a new requirement in the code. But further clarification of this requirement is mainly taken from King County's stormwater manual. So this will all look very familiar if you're used to doing work in King County. And the requirement is to mitigate the direct impacts of the project that would cause or increase downstream issues. And it's not intended to fix existing issues. The rule further clarifies existing code language on performing a downstream erosion and capacity analysis a 1/4 mile downstream from the project discharge point. And the analysis will be based on a 25-year event and most often applies to the ditch and culvert system that has limited capacity. And if there is either areas that would cause or increase downstream issues by a project, the improvements could include providing flow control on site or lining a ditch for erosion issues, or installing a berm within the right of way to mitigate any potential flooding issues a project would cause. The next section is about the projects not conducted in the public right of way. And like I said, this is, for example, parcel-based projects. And as I noted, extending the public drainage system is always a requirement. There's language in here. Much of what is added in the general requirement sections is from an existing director's rule for 40.1. For example, corner lots and easements. That language just was updated for the drainage or for the drainage system. And then it also takes in info from various locations and incorporates the 5,000 square foot new and replaced threshold into the code and rule. And the curb discharge section is incorporated from the existing site sewer director's rule, and then track changes are noted from that original document. So you can easily see what has changed from what is currently in the site sewer director's rule. And as I said, we had a new requirement related to transportation projects and extending mainline extensions of the public drainage system for those projects as well is added. And finally, the last part of the document is basically taking language from an existing client assistant memo, or CAM 1180, which a lot of you I'm sure are familiar with, and then incorporating that into a rule, and then taking that existing language that people are familiar with and then noting track changes from there, so you can specifically see where the track changes are from that existing client assistant memos. And the requirements for this applies to the public drainage system and not public infrastructure. So that's my last slide, and I'll hand it back to Gretchen. And I'm a little bit over.
Yeah. No problem, Cheryl. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca and Matthew. They're going to be tag teaming on this portion and talking about the key stormwater manual changes. Matthew will be, and then Rebecca will start with the key changes in volume 1.
Sounds good. Thanks, Gretchen. And thanks for walking us through the code, Sherelle, and director's rule. There we go. All right, so I wanted to start off with just an overview of the 5 volumes. So those of you that use the Stormwater Manual are probably pretty familiar with this structure, and it hasn't changed for this manual update. So volume 1, we're talking about the project minimum requirements. Volume 2, we're talking about construction stormwater control. Volume 3 is project stormwater control. Volume 4 is source control, and volume 5 is enforcement. And I just wanted to note a couple items here. The one missing piece are the drainage maps in volume 1. Those have not been posted yet, but they're in progress. The remaining new and updated figures have been integrated directly into the volumes and appendices. So if you're looking for those, there's not a separate figure packet this time. They're actually in the volumes and appendices, so you can find those there. And look at that summary of changes tables if you're curious about which ones have been updated. Also wanted to note that in volume 1, we still have the code language callout boxes, and there's a draft watermark stamped on those. So take a look at the code itself and not the text within volume 1. We'll be doing a final pass through and making sure that's all updated to the final code language once the code is finalized. And then also wanted to point out that a errata sheet was posted today, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later, but that includes several updates to some of the proposed sizing tables that are in volume 3. So definitely take a look at that if you're interested in some of the sizing factor updates, because that's the latest and greatest changes based on some recent modeling updates. And I have a slide covering which tables that includes. Volume 1, similar to the code, we did talk about this pretty extensively during the November 2020 public meeting, so just wanted to note that you can refer to those slides in the recording for the following sections that are listed here that we didn't change in the winter 2021 draft. So if you're interested in some of these sections or chapters, make sure you take a look at those slides and recording from that last public meeting. Today, we did want to focus on a few things that have changed in volume 1, so noted here by those red lightning bolts. So related to the director's rule the new director's rule that Sherelle was talking about, there were some changes made in chapter 2, step 3. So we added requirements for approved point of discharge, requirements for conveyance systems to point of discharge, and references to that new director's rule. So you'll notice there's some different language there, and also added some similar language at the end of chapter 3. So just kind of folding in that new director's rule and making sure that that language was consistent there. In chapter 4, we have the new flow charts, so make sure you take a look at those. Those are included in sections 4.3 and 4.4 for both roadway projects and parcel-based projects. And Sherelle already did a shout out to Liz on her retirement, but she took the reins on those and helped us update those flow charts. So take a look at those and walk through those and make sure everything looks good there. We also added an example of a groundwater discharge rate that would not trigger the peak flow control standards. So you can find that at section 4437. So that's my volume 1. That was pretty fast. So we did a lot of updates on volume 1 in the fall, but yeah, just a few minor tweaks here for the winter 2021 draft. Also some pretty minor changes in volume 2. So we just have one slide on volume 2 today, but wanted to highlight a couple things here. You'll notice there's just the one red lightning bolt here under minor BMP revisions. And if you take a look at that summary of changes table, you'll note that there's 5 different BMPs that have had revisions since the spring 2020 review draft. So some pretty minor changes related to stabilized construction access, some minor changes in figure 14, which is in the filter fence section, some additional references in the building repair, remodeling, and construction BMP, clarified the requirements for discharge structure and the temporary dewatering BMP, and also updated some of the timelines in table 9, which is the solid waste and handling and disposal requirements related to recent updates there. So take a look at that in the summary changes tables, and that'll walk you through the changes to volume 2. Volume 3 is kind of where we want to spend most of our time today, since that's where we had the bulk of our changes in this latest draft, and the bulk of changes that those of you that work on BMP design are probably interested in as well. So here, again, I'm going to focus on the red lightning bolts here. So many of these items have been further revised and clarified for this latest draft. There's one here related to guidance related to the infiltration investigation map. That's a fairly minor edit, but you'll want to take a look at the language there, just further clarifying how that should be applied. Figures, as I mentioned, are integrated into chapters 3 and chapters 5 of volume 3, so take a look at those. There are also BMP updates and clarifications. We'll walk through these in a little more detail, but throughout chapter 5, there's just further refinement on BMP design and sizing and the figures there as well. We also added that, as we mentioned, we had added that new BMP previously, the sidewalk and trail compost amended strip, but we made some further refinements in that BMP, so we'll walk through what some of those changes are. Added some new figures, and also here's the reminder to adjust the HSPF parameters, and I've got a couple slides related to this as well, so we'll walk through that. So Sherelle had mentioned, there's some pretty substantial changes related to sizing when you're looking at changing these HSPF parameters. So I just wanted to point out for those of you that are actually doing the modeling where you can find those in case you haven't done this modeling in a while. So those 3 parameters that we're looking at are the LSIR, the overland flow length, SLSIR, which is the slope of overland flow, and NSIR, which is Manning's N. Within WWHM, this is the tools menu here, tools screenshot, and there's view, edit, purlins, and implins here. And if you click on the view, edit, implins here, you'll see that's where you can change your LSIR, SLSIR, and NSIR for your different land use types. So that's where you find that in WWHM. And that'll be highlighted in your output report, so you'll know which ones you've changed. In MGS Flood, it's also on the Tools menu or the Tools tab in MGS Flood. And here it's under HSPF, runoff parameters, and parameter region. And there's a little 3 dots here that say Edit HSPF parameters. In MGS Flood, you get both your purlins and implins on the same screen. And again, you've got LSIR, SLSIR, and NSIR here are the 3 that you should be changing. And in MGS, as you change these, it'll underline them in red, so you'll know which ones you've changed here, and that also will show up in your output report as well. Other changes in volume 3, starting off with some of the overview chapters. So chapter 3, as I mentioned, we clarified that guidance related to the infiltration investigation map, also some clarifications related to water quality treatment and which BMPs apply. In chapter 4, we added a new subsection with modeling guidance for wetland hydroperiod protection. We also added a reference to that new director's rule, the public drainage system requirements. And we moved some of that content that was in chapter 4 previously. Some of that got shifted to volume 1 and shifted to the director's rule. So you'll notice there was some content in there before that's moved elsewhere. So it's not just taken away, but it's shifted to another part of the manual. And then also clarified where infiltration testing can be performed in section 4321. So jumping into volume 5, that's where some of the major changes were made related to clarification related to some of the BMPs. So this is all the way from the 2016 manual, what these X's account for. So X denotes a change from the 2016 manual. So you'll notice some of these BMPs have quite a bit of changes and things that have been updated. If it's a green highlighted row, that's what I'm going to talk about in more detail, either on a separate slide or just in some notes here. So a couple things I wanted to point out here, the soil amendment BMP, there's a new figure there. Sidewalk trail compost amended BMP, this is again that new BMP that Sherelle mentioned, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in a couple slides. And then infiltrating bioretention, I also wanted to mention, we're clarified the design criteria related to mulch, updated the figures within that section, and also updated the sizing factors. Our next set of BMPs, perennial pavement facilities, that's one where we updated the figure 5.17, also updated the sizing factors. Infiltration chambers faults, I don't have a separate slide on this, but I just wanted to note that this has been updated pretty substantially from 2016. We didn't make a lot of changes for this latest round, but do take a look at that. There's a lot of new text there and some updates and clarifications that have been made since the spring 2020 draft, if you looked at that. Rainwater harvesting, again, I don't have a separate slide for that, but that was one that Sherelle mentioned that it's listed now in Category 2 and Category 4 of the on-site list. And we did add some sizing guidance there. So if you're doing rainwater harvesting sizing, take a look at that. And we walked through some steps and how you would evaluate that within the modeling framework. So take a look at that. For detentions, ponds, pipes, and vaults chambers, for detention ponds, we only made minor revisions for this draft, but I'll be going over some of the design criteria that apply to all types of detention systems. And then also detention cisterns, no new edits other than the sizing factor updates that are in the errata sheet. And then other detention options not listed here. We didn't have any edits in that section. On this slide, we'll be talking about non-infiltrating bioretention in a couple slides, so we'll focus on that a little bit more. So that's another one that's been updated pretty substantially. And also just wanted to touch on proprietary and emerging water quality treatment technologies here at the end of Chapter 5. I don't have a separate slide on this, but wanted to highlight that there was a BMP that got added back in the spring 2020 draft. That's the MWS linear modular wetland. We clarified the application of offline versus online flows when sizing those BMPs. And also you may notice that the current draft doesn't include any mass loading ratios right now, or MLRs. That's something that we were working with kind of at the last minute in terms of simplifying that process and making things more consistent there to make that easier for vendors to kind of get an MLR in place. So we're still working on that process, and you'll notice there's some TBDs in that table within the section. So as I mentioned, I wanted to focus on some of these major changes that have been made either since the 2016 manual or this latest draft. So here's the areas that I want to focus on today. So we'll start with the sidewalk trail compost amended strip. So as we noted, this is a new BMP. The figure is also new and has been updated for this draft. A few reminders and clarifications that we made for this latest draft. Just a reminder that this BMP can be used for trails or sidewalks that are up to 25 feet wide. All widths, the hard surface, the BMP, the level spreader are measured perpendicular to the edge of the hard surface that's adjacent to the BMP. We also clarified the type of vegetation that's acceptable. So turf or dense ground cover is typical, but additional shrubs and trees can also be added to the design. The overflow path must be vegetated and at least 10 feet from a building or property line, excluding the right-of-way. And we also added sizing factors and clarified how to model the BMP explicitly. On the next slide, we wanted to point out, we've got a couple new figures in there. These haven't been updated since the spring 2020 draft, but just wanted to note that figure 5.19 and 520, there's a concrete edge example and a geomembrane edge example. Just wanted to note that these are both examples of possible edge treatments, but the city will also allow other options, including proprietary options. So this is just helping provide some guidance on what different types of edge treatments can be used for permeable pavement. Just a couple examples there. Detentions, ponds, pipes, and vaults chambers. So wanted to note here that these setbacks were added previously, but since it's a big change from the 2016 manual, I wanted to highlight some of these items here today. So these are added setbacks for all detention BMPs from ECA steep slopes and landslide prone areas when geotechnical analysis is required. For these three types of or iterations of these BMPs, there's a 200-foot setback from the ECA steep slope or landslide prone areas. So if you're using a modular stackable chamber, such as an R tank, a detention chamber with an open bottom, or a CMP detention pipe, then you've got this 200-foot setback here. We've also added design criteria for modular stackable chambers. So that's something that's a change from the 2016 manual, and then revised and clarified exfiltration testing requirements for both pipes and vaults. Looking at detention pipes specifically, there's a new figure 5.26 that shows manifolded detention pipes on private property. And we added a minimum 24-inch connector pipe diameter for detention pipes. So you'll note that there on the figure. Non-infiltrating bioretention was also a BMP that had some pretty significant updates from the 2016 manual. So there's an added setback from the top of the ECA steep slope landslide prone area. We've got revised liner requirements that refers you to Appendix E. We've got a reference, a clarification to the land use code section that's looking at front, side, and rear yard setbacks. And just noting here that storage capacity doesn't apply to non-infiltrating bioretention. And reduced sizing factors when used for the on-site stormwater management list approach. So that's more aligned with the water quality treatment sizing. So the sizing factors have gone down. And also wanted to note here that using non-infiltrating bioretention to meet the peak control standard is no longer applicable. With the new standard, we found that it really just can't meet the peak standard. So there's changes in the table there related to that. The last thing I wanted to point out here, as I mentioned, there's an errata sheet that was just posted today, and it was up on the website recently. So when Matthew does his walkthrough at the end, he can kind of point you towards where that is. But there were changes to 8 different tables, sizing tables. So 3 of those are related to on-site list sizing for infiltrating bioretention, rain gardens, and non-infiltrating bioretention. There's also pre-size flow control credits that have been updated for permeable pavement surfaces. And we've also distinguished that that's now with and without check dams, since with the latest model update, there's some pretty significant changes, whether you're modeling with or without a check dam. So that's been added to the table there. For detention pipes, vaults, and detention cisterns, that's one where we added or modified the contributing area ranges. And as Cheryl mentioned, we also added the orifice diameters to make that clear there, what was used for the pre-sizing. And then, as I mentioned here, for non-infiltrating bioretention, the peak control standard is now not allowed for 12 inches of ponding where it was previously. So that's the list of tables that have been updated. Volume 4, we just have one slide here, so fairly minor revisions in the winter 2021 public review draft, and those were in BMP 3, 9, and 16, if you want to take a look at those in the summary of changes table. Also the rooftop dog run BMP, which is our new BMP 8, got updated, so there's some changes there. And then referencing the landscape management plan and integrated pest management plans, which are now in Appendix I, that got added as well. So just some additional links and clarifications added there that you may want to take a look at if you use Volume 4. All right, and next I'm going to cover our changes in the appendices. So here's our list. We've now got Appendix A through I. You'll note that Appendix B used to be related to Volume 2, is now repurposed and related to Volume 1. And then Appendix I got expanded to add the landscape management plan requirements if you took a look at that during our last public review period in the fall. So Appendix A is the definitions appendix right now. That's just a placeholder and refers to the code, but that will be populated for the final manual. And then Matthew, did you want to jump in and briefly cover updates to Appendix B?
Yeah, I wanted to go over, so Appendix B, there's 2 sections in it, and the first one is meant to describe the drainage review process for MUPs, especially the subdivisions, short plats, lot boundary adjustments, and unit lot subdivisions. And so we did some further refinement in those sections that you should take a look at. Also, the timing for full subdivisions and short subdivisions of when the shared stormwater facilities, we tweaked that code language just slightly, just to make it a little more flexible for developers. And we've described some of the utility easements that will be required on plats, and I expanded the section on the lot boundary adjustments. And so this is a brand new section, so I encourage everybody to go through and take a look. If you still have questions about what's happened, what's going on for drainage review for MUPs, please let me know. Please comment, and we can try to address that. And the other section is just kind of the drainage report format and content. So we made a few more clarifications and refinements in there, and clarified that you may not need everything in this. It's not going to be a strict adherence to this form, but it shows you all the elements that may be required. Okay.
All right, and I think you've only got one slide this time, so
Yeah.
all in one slide. But Matthew had some more detailed information that he presented back in the fall. So if you're interested in some more detail behind Appendix B, that's there, or just take a look at it and read through it. So great, thanks, Matthew. I wanted to also cover Appendix C. There were a few updates to the on-site stormwater management and feasibility criteria. So the main things I wanted to highlight here were related to added and revised and feasibility criteria. This first one is just a clarification. It's not a change in the requirements. So there was kind of this petroleum chemical liquid hazardous storage waste tank note kind of tucked in at the end. So we just integrated that to make that a little bit cleaner language there. So that's not a change, just a modification of the current language. There is a new infeasibility criterion related to skate parks, bike parks, and sport courts for permeable pavement facilities and permeable pavement surfaces. So that got added in Table C3. The infeasibility criteria for sidewalk, trail, compost amended strips got added as well. So you could take a look at those also in Table C3. And then there's 3 new infeasibility criteria for non-infiltrating bioretention that you can find in Table C5. Appendix D had some pretty minor changes for this draft. So there are some pretty minor clarifications in the groundwater monitoring section, D5, one minor modification in section D 8.1. And then I think the main changes came in this acceptance testing requirements section, D-8.2. Mainly just clarifying that step 1, observation of subsurface conditions, and step 2, infiltration testing of differing soil conditions, those are recommended but optional. And step 3, which is your acceptance testing of your backfilled BMP, is a required step. So you can find that in section D-8.2. In Appendix E, there's some minor changes scattered throughout Appendix E. The main thing here, some updates to the plant list. Really, that was just adding design and O&M considerations based on a review by a landscape architect. Removed a couple of species due to winter dieback and availability of other species that are better suited for bioretention function, and some things that require extremely wet conditions. So just taking a look at some of the species that were listed in there. So there's a few changes, a few things got removed. Some others were aggressive spreaders and things like that. So a few species did come off that list. Also in the latter part of Appendix E, there's a section on dry well sizing. So there's a new table that got added there, Table E27, for dry well sizing downstream of bioretention sized for the on-site stormwater management standard. And the preceding tables to that, we also reincorporated the sizing factors that were in the 2016 manual. So those got added back in, but there's this new table at the end. For Appendix F, some fairly minor changes here. We added a section on, or added some language on the required HSPF parameter modifications, which I mentioned previously and had those couple of slides with the screenshots from WHM and MGS Flood on. We also added some language from the ecology manual on how the flow duration standard is calculated in continuous model. So that's something that's already kind of baked into the models, but it's helpful to have that background language to know how it's actually calculating the flow duration standard. So we folded in that language there. There's a new updated rain gauge figure and some updated text and a figure related to tidal influence and sea level rise. So those got updated based on some recent references. And then some additional text related to how the on-site performance standard is applied in the latest version of MGS Flood. There was some older language in there, so we just updated that to be a little more clear with how the models actually apply that standard and calculate that standard. In Appendix G, the big change here that we heard, I think all the way back from our 2019 public meeting with external manual users, is that there was a wish to have the recommended inspection frequencies added back into Appendix G. I think in 2009, it actually just said inspection frequency, so we made sure we added the word recommended here. So these are not required inspection frequencies, but they're recommended inspection frequencies just to help as you're developing your O&M plans. Hopefully this is useful information to have. So that's been added throughout Appendix G for all the BMPs. Some other minor changes as we added that back in. If you're looking back to the 2009 manual, we just made the noxious weed inspection frequency consistent through all the BMPs. There was a little bit of a difference there with how that was applied in 2009, so that's now consistently March to October. updated some terminology for consistency with the rest of the manual, so catch basin filter socks instead of inserts. And then there's some missing information in the vegetated roof O&M table related to growth medium defects or problems. So we just filled in those missing edits there. All right, Appendix H had no new edits in winter 2021 and only one very minor edit from 2016. So that's not a huge change there. Appendix I, as I mentioned, we did kind of a major update here for the fall 2020 draft, and only just a couple minor clarifications for the winter 2021 draft. So here now we've mentioned that integrated pest management plan would be required as part of a landscape management plan, and also updated step 1 under the integrated pest management plan process for a clarification that was requested by ecology. And we also added, let's see, I think that's all I had there. So take a look at that. That new landscape management plan section is new in the fall, and then some minor changes to the integrated pest management plans as well. All right. So it looked like I had some questions come in while I was talking. But do we want to hold those? Sherelle may have answered one.
Yeah, we have a few questions. I wonder if we just want to go through next steps and then get into the formal Q&A. Does that work for everybody?
Yep. That sounds good.
Okay, great. Just a couple of slides on next steps, and we're going to be going through this here. So we're currently in the 3rd public review phase for the draft 2021 Stormwater Code and Manual. And this review phase covers January through February. And the public comments are due by Friday, February 19th. And in just a moment, I am going to turn it over to Matthew, and he's going to do a screen share just to orient you all to where you can provide comments on the screen that you'll see in front of you. There is the link to SDCI's webpage where the documents are posted, as well as a link to the comment spreadsheet, which is an Excel form that is also posted on the SDCI's webpage. You'll email the completed spreadsheet if you do have comments that you'd like to share to the email address that's also listed here on the slide as well. So the link gets you directly to the website, and then you would email that comment spreadsheet back to the email address that's listed here. And related to where we are in the timeline, so what comes next? The legislative process will occur in the spring of 2021, with the new code taking effect by July 2021. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew to orient you to the project page and where you can find the things that you need to be able to provide public comment.
All right, Matthew, I'll stop sharing if you want to go ahead and pull up your website.
Okay. So I'm just going to share. I'll just run you through the website and where you can find everything. So this is our updating stormwater regulations website. The first page is kind of some general information about what's going on. The second page, Get Involved. This page has the comment template, which is like I said, is an Excel spreadsheet. So download this and do a save as, and add your comments, and then send them to this email address. And we definitely really appreciate your comments and take them seriously. The project documents page has all of the current drafts. We have the current stormwater manual if you want to look back to see how it compares. We start off with summary of changes, and I know, like in this summary of change, there's the first page is kind of a general overview, but then the next pages get into really specific changes. So this is really helpful. We've got our stormwater code, the actual code here, so you can see all the changes. And then here we have the related codes and directors' roles. So this is the new SPU public drainage system director's role that Sherelle was talking about, that will define mainline extensions and the ensured sufficient capacity. And for people familiar with it, this replaces the SDCI's small project point of discharge protocol. So it's pretty important for projects with less than 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface. Specifically, one of the biggest changes that formally combined will not be allowed for small projects anymore. We've got the draft grading code in here, and there's a really small draft land use code that we're going to implement. And then we have each of the volumes of the stormwater manual in here, along with all the appendices, and another link to the comment template and the email address. We also got some general background about the stormwater code manual, and then an overall timeline. So I'll stop sharing now and give it back to Gretchen.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Matthew. And just a reminder, and as it states on the PowerPoint as well, that February 19th, Friday, February 19th is the final day for submitting public comments via the spreadsheet form that Matthew just shared with you all. And with that, that formally concludes the presentation portion of our meeting today, and then we are going to move into the Q&A. And we've gotten some questions to get us started in the chat. And just a reminder, we're doing this two ways. So using the chat function can absolutely, we're monitoring that, and we'll read through the questions that we've received in the chat so far as a starting place. But feel free to also use the hand raise function as well if you prefer to verbally ask your question. And with that, we'll start from the top in terms of the questions that we've received. And folks, just a quick reminder to stay muted unless you're addressing the group. So the first question that we got was from Matt. And the question is, will more of the definitions in the grading code be updated to match the stormwater code, such as for earth material, excavation, fill, land disturbing activity, etc.? And if the grading code references the stormwater code definition, that would seem to be most straightforward to ensure that the two codes are consistent.
We hadn't planned on updating any other definitions. But if you have any comments, we'd be happy to consider that.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. And it looks like Tim's question about the required flow path for a typical 5-foot sidewalk is that the response to that from Sherelle in the chat. The next question is from Lisa Harbert. Are you worried the CMP pipe will leak?
Yes, the CMP pipe typically isn't exactly watertight. And that's the same reason that we don't allow it for installation under buildings. So that's why we have the 200-foot setback from ECA slopes.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And the next question here is from, let's see, is this a question? From Gary Elson. The question is, because of recent findings that tire additive derivatives have been shown to cause salmon pre-spawn mortality, do you have any additional control information such as street sweeping, especially around creeks, with how to guidance and scheduling requirements?
I'll answer that question, and I also will answer Bill's question at the bottom at the same time. So what Gary, I believe, is referring to is there's a new study out from Washington State University about pre-spawn mortality, and that it's caused by tire additives is what the conclusion of the study is. And so that everyone's looking at that, and it's very interesting, and we're definitely taking that into consideration. And one of the things Gary brings up is street sweeping to try and deal with that before it gets into the water bodies, that accumulation of sediment and the like from tire additives. And in the chat, I just put in that. I tried to put it in. I put it in twice because the first time it didn't come out right. But we do. Seattle already has a very extensive street sweeping program because we realize that that's one of the best ways for water quality is to prevent tire and brake sediment or particulates coming and getting into the water bodies. So there's a link to that. Yes, we agree that that's one of the best ways, other than not having pollutants in the first place, but we'll be a long ways before we get to that as a society. But this is one of the ways that the city is already working on reducing water quality impacts. So then Bill asked if there was any news on negotiation with ecology about runoff drainage from playfields being regulated less stringently. And so we received the last fall public outreach, we received comments on both water quality and related to fields and play fields, and also runoff related to playing fields. And because of the study and because of not knowing exactly what pollutants there are associated in the fields, the talking with the ecology hasn't really gone forward because of some of these new findings. That said, I know that there's artificial turf is using cork and things like that, but there's still we're still looking for information to show that those fields are not producing pollutants from any of the constituents of the fields. And then the other thing about flows off of those fields, sorry, my cat is deciding to talk. I don't know why, but the runoff, we've had flooding downstream of fields after a field has been put in with under drains. And so flow control, evaluating a flow control performance standard is still required because when a field is put in, but there are ways to construct the field so that a separate detention tank is not required. That involves where you can raise those under drains and allow infiltration before the flows get into those under drains and discharge to the downstream system. And so there's ways to do it, working with the manufacturers, so your warranties are not whatever you call it, so your warranties aren't voided, but there are ways, and it has to do with the underlying infiltration rate of the field. So if you have a really good infiltration rate where you're putting these artificial turf fields underlying, then you can meet the flow control requirements. But if it's not, then there are runoff, and we've experienced that in our downstream systems. So.
Great, thank you, Shreya. The next question is from Payal. UST is already regulated by ecology. Why is the UST exemption removed in the grading code?
What we're concerned about, the geotechnical group at SDCI and the drainage group, we want to a lot of these tanks are down in groundwater, or when they're backfilled, we want to make sure that the backfill is constructed right, so it's stable and there's not impacts to other neighborhoods. So from an environmental standpoint of the tank itself, that's kind of under ecology, but we're just thinking about the actual construction and where they're going to, if they dig out groundwater, where they're going to discharge to, that sort of thing. So that's why we removed it from the grading permit threshold.
Hey Matt, this is
Matthew.
Majid. Can you clarify whether that includes like a normal oil tank for like a home, or are we talking about like bigger underground storage tanks like for gas stations and stuff?
It would be any tank, but it would have to trigger one of the grading permit thresholds. So you're not exempt from the grading permit just because you're a tank removal. Your tank may be small enough that you don't trigger the grading code, the grading permit.
Thanks, Matthew. The next question is for Payal. From Payal. Extracting groundwater is a trigger for a grading permit. Does that include projects that require dewatering due to high water table?
Yes, that would do it. But most of those projects would probably trigger a grading permit anyway. And grading permits, and one thing, SDCI and actually SDOT, that we don't require a separate grading permit. Usually a grading permit is built into the building permit. So people don't realize that they're getting grading permits, but they're actually part of their building permit. So there's not likely to require that many more permits than are required. I think the groundwater remediation projects, that's been kind of a gray area where you're not doing a lot of grading, but you are sucking a lot of groundwater out of the earth. That's something that will clearly trigger a grading permit now that was kind of in the area before.
Great, thanks, Matthew. The next question from Lori Farr. For required mainline extensions, will there be a process for requesting deviations, and will cost impact be included as a factor in the consideration? And then she writes, concerned with SFR projects or small unit lot developments over 5,000 square feet.
The rules for mainline extensions aren't changing, or the deviation process, and cost is not included in that factor. So that process won't change.
Thanks, Cheryl.
So there is, I want to add to that, so there is a mainline determination meeting that happens every week. And that process has gone on to Excella. So it could be an electronic application. So that's the process that'll be continuing. So and it's going to be a little more efficient now that it's going through Excella. And so anything could be, any mainline extension could still be appealed like it was before.
Okay. Great, thank you both. The next question is from Payal. There are new requirements applicable to combined sewer areas in Volume 4 source control. For existing facilities, when and how would these new requirements apply?
So if it's a substantial alteration of existing facility, then the new requirements would apply. And there's a definition within the in the Volume 4 of the Stormwater Manual that talks about substantial alteration. If there's something missing there, then let us know.
Great. And then there's a second question embedded here too. The city doesn't require companies, organizations to retrofit their facilities to meet the updated requirements unless part of the redevelopment project, correct?
Correct, and that's that substantial alteration. Matthew, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, other than there's a lot of practices that should be updated as far as structure controls that would be based on the substantial alterations.
Great. Thank you. The next question is from Tim Gavillion. Can you clarify what is vesting a project to the stormwater point of discharge given the new SBU director's rule, PAR issuance, or accepted building permit intake?
That's the same as it is now. I think it's, well, the PAR issuance, I think, but it really is that what we just Matthew, what did you, I think it was just clarified.
So we're going to start updating our PARs. We plan on doing PARs in accordance with the new code starting April 1st. And so we would honor the PARs if it's within the 18, the PAR is valid. But in general, typically the vesting is going to be based on a submitted and paid for application on July 1st, 2021.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Payab. Why is infiltration listed as the lowest priority approved point of discharge in Volume 1?
So this isn't new language. It's actually just taken from Volume 3 and moved up to Volume 1. And it's, when it says infiltration, basically it says you need to go to a water body, connect to a public drainage system, or I'm getting tired, and then it goes down the list, connect to combine, and then on-site infiltration. That infiltration, we still want infiltration through on-site stormwater BMPs, but for the larger storm events, tying into the city system is what the priority list is about. so we don't cause flooding and things like that. So that's the approved point of discharge. That doesn't mean that we're not wanting infiltration for the smaller storm events through the on-site stormwater management requirement.
And most BMPs, most infiltrating BMPs have overflows. They're not designed to take on like all of the drainage for the entire precipitation time series that you're modeling. So they do require overflow. So that's the overflows. That's where these approved points of discharges really come in.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Lori Farr. For the fields, with respect to the infiltration testing, where infiltration rates are less than 0.3 per hour is not measurable by typical practices, would the city consider following head infiltration testing or other testing?
Matthew or Mary, or I can't answer that question. Do you have a
No, I think we would stick with the infiltration testing requirements that are in the manual.
Next question here is from Guy Callie. In addition to detention pipes, will the manual revisions allow/address detention vaults for road projects since they are more efficient at storing runoff?
So this, I don't think the stormwater code doesn't really address that. That would be if they're in the road. It's more of SDOT and SPU review and kind of more of their policies. So it's not that this. I think SDOT and SPU still want to avoid vaults and pipes in the road where possible, just because of all the congestion it causes.
Yeah. Matthew's right, and I think a lot of times the vaults don't fit, but I can't. It's a maintenance issue and what the long-term asset requirements are for the city once it takes over that infrastructure. So, but the stormwater code, like Matthew said, is silent on that in the right of way.
Great. Okay, next question is from Jennifer. Is there any clarification on when underdrain/French drains will trigger hard surface considerations for landscape areas?
I did add a clarification, Jennifer, and so that it's in volume 1, and what it's the areas that are like hydraulically connected to that French drain through like free draining material. That's the extent of the areas for like French drains or under drains that would be considered hard surfaces. So just putting a single French drain in the middle of a grass field doesn't make the whole grass field a hard surface, but it's just those areas that are I call it hydraulically connected through like a quick draining surface or gravel.
Great. And I'm scrolling through. It doesn't look like any additional questions. I do want to pause and know we've got a few more minutes. If folks do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And also, if you'd like to verbally ask your question, please use the hand raise function and ask your question. Do a final call, and we'll just pause for an awkwardly long amount of time before we formally close. So we'll do a final scroll through of questions. One just came in from Jennifer. Matthew, can you clarify what hydraulically connected means?
I'd say that it's connected through like a free draining media or pipe. So if it's if it's connected through a free draining gravel, that's what I'm referring to as hydraulically connected. So like through a pipe or free draining gravel. So those surfaces will be considered underdrained and considered hard surfaces.
Thanks, Matthew. The next question from Lisa. The theory has always been that oversizing a bioretention pond is bad, but now we are making them bigger. That's a question. Are you finding that they are failing or not properly sized?
Rebecca, do you have thought? I'm not exactly, yeah.
I don't believe we're necessarily making them bigger. Actually, one thing that's probably important to point out, I was going to pull up, this is where the
Oh,
errata
okay.
is. I think Matthew kind of scrolled by that. It's kind of tucked in here under the summary of changes rather than down below, but I was just going to open that oh, that's not working. Okay.
I got that. Yeah, I got that just a second ago
Oh.
too. It's telling me that somebody's gonna try and I think it's a new Chrome thing, so you can
Okay.
reload
Well,
it if you want.
I've got it here, so I will just pull this up.
Yeah.
I had it on the other screen at least. So so this is one thing. I'm not sure if we're talking about infiltrating bioretention or not, but actually with the revised factors here highlighted in yellow, they're actually getting slightly smaller with the revised modeling. So make sure you take a look at the errata, and I'm not sure if that addresses the question or not, but we, as Sherelle mentioned, we did find with the Van Ganuchen that they were actually getting slightly smaller rather than larger. So some of these sizing factors that look like they were jumping up in the version of volume 3 that's posted, they're actually going down slightly in the errata, if that helps address. I don't know if that addresses the question or not.
I think are they going down or staying the same? I think.
Or staying the same. Yep, you're right.
And there
That's
is
for
a follow-up point here from Lisa, the woman that asked the question. You said that if we model, the sizes are getting bigger, and then the chart she references a chart that said 80% bigger.
Oh, I think that's your slide from the presentation. Sherelle, do you want me to pull that up?
Sure.
Let's see if I can.
I think those were the infiltrating bioretention,
Mhm.
but non-infiltrating is not even going to be able to meet the peak standard anymore, and making it even bigger will make it detain even less.
Right.
Maybe while we get there, I'll ask another question from Payal. In volume 3, a section was added for wetland hydro period protection. It's not clear when this analysis is required to be performed. When is this modeling required?
So in the Stormwater Code, in probably volume 1 as well, I'm more familiar with the code than I am the manual. It talks about when the hydro period protection is required, and it's probably not going to happen very often, if ever, in the city of Seattle. It's when you have a class 1 or class 2 wetland, and you have access to the wetland, and I can't even remember. It's a certain kind of wetland that isn't very often in the city of Seattle. So this is a requirement from ecology, and actually would probably is going to apply outside of the city of Seattle. But it does talk about in the Stormwater Code when you would have to do the wetland hydro period protection, and gives a bunch of different criteria for that. So yeah, Matthew, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, there may be a few class 1 or 2. I think it's riverine impounding or depressional wetlands, but most of the wetlands in Seattle are not, and you may not have access to those when your project discharges to them. So most of the projects will just go back on to the old method that we had in the previous manual. But there's also some wetlands that you're going to need to do a wetland categorization, and some wetlands won't even require modeling, just kind of some general wetland protection BMPs.
Yeah, look at the class of the wetlands. Yeah, the lower class wetlands are not required for modeling. I apologize.
Yeah, and I think our volume 1 is just going to refer to the code. There's a code box that refers to the section, so you'll probably want to check the section and go look in the code, and
Right.
it steps you through when it's required.
Right.
Great. And now that we've got this slide pulled up, Sherelle, point of clarification on this and related to the question about modeling, the sizes are getting bigger.
Right. And so basically, well, I don't know, Rebecca, do you have a better,
Yeah. And I wanted to point out, this is just related to the peak control standard. So this isn't
Right.
necessarily for all the standards. So as I was talking about with the on-site list, the sizes are actually getting slightly smaller. So with every standard, you're looking, tweaking different knobs and things like that. So with the peak control standard, the pre-sizing, if you had been using the pre-sizing for the peak control standard, that's not really changing that much. It's actually going down slightly. It was, as Sherelle was talking about, if you're modeling and not tweaking those HSPF parameters that I mentioned, where the sizing gets larger. So the pre-sizing that was out there previously had already tweaked those knobs for you, and just with the base modeling without tweaking those knobs, it's getting larger. So I think it's not directly a apples to apples comparison. So it's a little convoluted, but I don't know if that addresses it or not. But yeah.
I think it's the answer is they're not. It's not because they're failing. It's because they weren't properly sized.
Yep.
So yeah. Based on.
And also a clarification that infiltrating bioretention does provide better. The larger it is, the better flow control benefit it provides, because because of the infiltration that the water is going into the ground instead of being discharged. Non-infiltrating, the larger the planters, sometimes the less benefit it is, because water goes quicker through the soils and is not ponded up as much.
And this is Mary stepping in, and I think we have some restrictions on how big the bioretention can be, and you need permission of the director to get up a certain size. And the concern there is with added sediment loading and being able to maintain it. And so yeah, there is a limit to the size that will allow without, getting director's permission.
And I think Lisa's also asking, were they working? And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of modeling, but do you, Mary or others, Rebecca, want to talk about what, if they're working? I mean, the peak standard is, anyway, do you have any feedback on that as well?
About whether they're working. Well, I think some of the larger ones we see that we're having problems with them because of sediment loading, and so that's why we're trying to keep them below a certain square footage. But the smaller ones, I'm not aware of any issues with them in the size range that is typical.
Yeah. And the pre-sized, which I think the smaller single family homes tend to be using, that's not really changing size.
We have a final question that we're able to get to here in our last couple of minutes from Jennifer. Are max BR cell sizing changing?
Mary, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to pull up the relevant section? I don't believe so.
I believe it's, yeah, I think it's like 800 square foot bottom area. And I believe, excuse me, I believe that was what was in the previous manual. So I don't think that has changed.
Yep.
Excellent. And with that, I just want to thank everybody so much for participating today. And a quick reminder that the public comments, the last date for providing public comments is coming up Friday, February 19th, and you can submit those via the Excel form on the project website. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thanks for your fantastic questions, and have a wonderful night. Good night.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for keeping us on track.
Great.
Thank you. Good job, you guys.
Thank you.